Okay, so before we look at the short run costs for the firm, let's think about this real world example involving production. So you all have heard of bubble wrap, I'm sure. So by eliminating air in plastic material, iBubble Wrap generates a 98% reduction in space for each roll of original bubble wrap material. So this is a new type of bubble wrap, and it saves space by eliminating the air in the bubble packaging. And this saved space has reduced the manufacturing company's own shipping expenses as well as the warehouse space of its customers and thus their costs. So by saving space, they're saving some costs. And the cost savings have induced shippers to pay up to $5,000 for each iBubble Wrap air pump, which is needed to inflate these sheets of bubble wrap with air, right? So they're packed and shipped without the air, and then they need a pump to put the air back into them. And so these pumps are going for a lot of money because of the cost savings that they afford the company. Pretty interesting. All right, so let's look at a cost of production example involving portable power banks. Okay, so way over here we've got total output. So this is the number of portable power banks being produced. And then we have our two different types of costs, right? So we've got fixed costs, which are our costs of capital, so machinery and buildings and things like that, things that we can't change in the short run. And you'll notice that because they're not changing, the cost of them is not changing either, right? So the total fixed cost of production is fixed. Imagine that. Okay. Then the other type of cost we have is variable costs. Now, for us, that's the costs of labor, since that's what the one thing we can change in the short run is we can increase the number of workers we have. Okay, so you will see that because it is variable, the cost is variable. And then these are our only costs, so adding them together gives us total costs. So it's just fixed costs plus variable cost equals total cost, right? So that's where that fourth column is coming from. So those are our total costs. We also will want to use or understand average costs, right? So average costs are going to be useful in analyzing firm behavior. And so we're basically just taking the average of all these things. So we have our totals here. To calculate the average, you just take the total and divide by output. Okay, so it's an average cost per unit, right? So you've got average fixed cost. Now here and here and here, you can't divide by 0, right? So we don't have a number for these ones here. But once we get beyond 0, we can start calculating averages, right? So here, when we produce 1 unit, the average fixed cost is just total fixed cost divided by 1, so 10. And then average variable cost is 5, and average total cost is 15. If we're looking at average fixed cost when there's 2 units being produced, that $10 fixed cost is being spread across 2 units, so on average, there's $5 of fixed cost for every unit when you make 2 units. Average variable cost, well, the total variable cost is 8. We divide that by 2, so that $8 variable cost is being split across 2 units for an average variable cost of $4. And then the total average total cost you can either get from dividing total cost by output, or you can also get it by adding up the 2 averages. So average fixed plus average variable gives you average total. So there's a couple different ways you can calculate it there. Okay, great. And then this is just a restatement of column 4, total costs. Okay, so it's the same as column 4 over here, but it's over here so that we can easily see where marginal cost is coming from. So this is the last one that's really important, is marginal cost. It's not an average, it's additional cost, right? So if we make 1 more unit, what does it cost us to make that unit? So we can see that it's just the difference between total costs. So when the firm makes 0 units, it has to pay those fixed costs whether it makes something or not. So total cost is 10, and when they make their first unit, it increases cost by 5. So that's what marginal cost is if the firm makes 1 more unit, how much does it increase their total cost by? If they go from making 1 unit to 2 units, that increases their total cost by $3. So that's, again, what marginal cost is. It's the increase in total cost by making 1 more unit. It turns out this one's going to be incredibly important. All right, so graphically, this is what the total costs look like. You see the black line is total costs, the red line is total variable costs, and the green line here is total fixed costs. So of course, total fixed costs aren't changing, so it's a flat line. Total variable costs are increasing, and then the gap here between total cost and total variable cost is just that $10 fixed cost, right? So that gap there is just the fixed cost, because to get to total cost, you're just adding these two together, right? So that's why the gap is fixed costs. And then here are our average cost curves and marginal cost curve. So the first thing I'll point out is that the average fixed cost curve is just getting closer and closer to 0, because our fixed cost, our total fixed cost, is staying the same, but we're dividing it by more and more units. So you've got a number on the top of the fraction being divided by a bigger and bigger number, and so this is going to just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now the average variable cost and the average total cost, on the other hand, kind of have this U shape, and that's basically coming from the fact that marginal product is increasing at first and then declining. These costs, these average costs, are going down at first because there's efficiency gains from that teamwork. But then as the firm hires more workers, they get less and less productive, and so those cost efficiencies, those cost gains, start to disappear and things get more costly. So that's why these two have this U shape. And then the gap here between these two is, again, just the fixed cost. So you'll notice that way out here, the gap between them is really big, and that's because the purple line here, average fixed cost, is really big when there's a low number of units being produced. But then the gap between these two starts to get smaller because average fixed cost is getting closer and closer to 0. And then the last one here, marginal cost, it also kind of has a U shape or a V shape in this case, but in most cases it has more of a smooth U shape. And the important thing to know about marginal cost is that it crosses these average cost curves, average variable cost and average total cost. It crosses them at their minimum, okay? So that's important to know. Okay, so I already talked about these a lot, just looking at the graphs, but let's go over them with some words just so we make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, so we looked at total costs, and these are just the sum of total fixed costs and total variable costs. And again, remember that fixed costs are the costs that don't change with output. That's why they're fixed. And they are the result of expenditures on capital, so machinery and buildings. And payments for those things have to be made whether the company makes 0 units or whether they make 1,000,000 units, right? The payment has to be made on those things whether they make anything or not. And it's staying the same because those inputs aren't changing. Whereas the variable costs, things like the cost of labor, can change, right? Because we might add more workers or we might decrease the number of workers. And so these costs are going to change with the level of production that the firm engages in. And of course, like we said, total cost is just the sum of these two, right? Total fixed cost plus total variable costs. Those are our only costs, so if we add them together, that gives us total overall costs. And then our average costs, we're just going to divide total by output, the quantity of output, so that we get a cost per unit measurement. Okay, so average total cost, we're just taking total cost and dividing it by the number of units. And what that gives us is, it gives us how much does each unit cost to produce on average, right? Which is going to be really useful for when we're trying to calculate things like profit, okay, the profit of the firm. Very similarly, average variable cost is just total variable cost divided by quantity. And average fixed cost is just total fixed cost divided by quantity. So that's how you calculate the averages. You just take their total and divide by the quantity output. The slightly harder one to calculate is marginal cost, but again, it's just what is the increase in total cost if we make one more unit, or if the firm makes one more unit, right? So what is the change in total cost given the change in output? So if the firm makes one more unit of output, how much does total cost increase by?